Greenwich, Connecticut, Christmas night. A woman sits in a rusted car, watching the snow bury $1 million lie. My name is Anna Porter, and inside that glowing house my family is carving up my life like the holiday turkey. They think the old man at the head of the table is asleep. They think the money is safe. But they forgot that winter reveals things when the leaves fall away. Tonight a pen will hit the mahogany table like a gunshot, and by the time the dessert is served, only one of us will be leaving with the truth. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. Now let's begin. The windshield wipers on my Honda were losing the war against the Connecticut winter. They slapped back and forth, smearing the heavy wet snow rather than clearing it, leaving a gray film that made the world look like an old dirty photograph. I leaned forward, gripping the steering wheel with hands that were still cold despite the heater running on full blast for the last hour. The vents only pushed out a lukewarm breath, smelling faintly of burnt oil and dust. It was Christmas, and the drive from the city had taken 4 hours instead of 2. The roads were slick, the kind of black ice that you don't see until the car drifts sideways, but I didn't mind the driving. It required focus. It kept my mind off where I was going. I turned off the main road and onto the private lane that led to the estate. The trees here were manicured even in winter, their branches trimmed back to form a perfect tunnel. The snow was deeper here, untouched and white, piling up against the stone walls that marked the property line. My tires crunched over the gravel as the house came into view. It was a sprawling colonial thing, brick and white pillars lit up like a hotel. It looked warm from the outside. That was the trick of the place. It always looked warm until you stepped through the door. There were 3 other cars in the circular driveway. My brother Mark's Range Rover, black and shining as if it had been detailed that morning, sat closest to the entrance. Beside it was my father's Mercedes and my mother's Lexus SUV. They looked like a fleet, heavy and expensive machinery built to insulate the people inside from the world. I pulled my Honda Civic in at the end of the line. The rust on the wheel well stood out against the pristine snow. The engine sputtered and died when I turned the key, a rattling cough that echoed in the quiet evening. I sat there for a moment, listening to the ticking of the cooling metal and the soft hush of the snow falling on the roof. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked tired. Double shifts at the diner all week had left dark circles under my eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. I rubbed my face, took a deep breath of the cold car air, and opened the door. The wind hit me instantly, biting through my wool coat. It was a good coat, practical, but it was 3 years old and showing wear at the cuffs. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and walked toward the front door. The snow crunched loudly under my boots. I didn't knock. I still had a key, though I rarely used it. The heavy oak door swung open and the heat of the house washed over me, smelling of pine needles, wood smoke, and expensive cologne. My mother Linda was in the foyer before I had even stamped the snow off my boots. She was wearing a red silk dress that looked tailored, her hair sprayed into a blonde helmet that wouldn't move in a hurricane. She held a crystal wine glass in one hand, half full of Chardonnay. "You made it," she said. It wasn't a greeting. It was a statement of fact, tinged with a slight disappointment that I hadn't spun off into a ditch. "The roads were bad," I said, unwinding my scarf. She looked me up and down, her eyes stopping on my coat. She took a sip of wine. "Is that the same coat you wore last year, Anna? You'd think with all those hours you work you could afford something that doesn't look like it came from a bin." "It's warm," I said. I hung it in the closet, pushing aside the fur and cashmere to make room. "Merry Christmas, Mom." "Merry Christmas." She turned and walked back toward the great room. "Your father is pouring drinks. Try not to track slush on the rugs." I followed her. The house was decorated to the hilt. Garlands of fresh pine wrapped around the banister, white lights twinkled from every corner, and a 12-foot tree stood in the center of the room, loaded with glass ornaments that probably cost more than my tuition had. It was beautiful and sterile. It felt like a museum exhibit of a Christmas, not a home. My father Robert stood by the fireplace swirling a scotch. He looked like an older, thicker version of my brother. He wore a cashmere sweater and slacks that held a sharp crease. When he saw me, he didn't smile. He set his glass down on the mantel and extended a hand. We shook. His palm was dry and smooth, the hand of a man who moved money, not things. "Anna," he said. "Traffic." "Snow," I said. "Mark made it in 2 hours," he said, picking up his drink again. "But then he has 4-wheel drive. You really should think about upgrading that car. It's an embarrassment to have it sitting in the driveway." "It runs fine, Dad. It's paid for." That was the line that always soured the air. Paid for. They hated that. They hated that I had gone to state instead of the Ivy League legacy school they had picked out. They hated that when they threatened to pull the funding if I didn't study pre-law, I had simply packed my bags and left. I waited tables, I bartended, I took out loans, and I got my degree in history. I lived in a walk-up apartment in the city with drafty windows, but I paid my own rent. To them, my independence wasn't a virtue. It was an insult to their control. "Well," he said, turning back to the fire, "get yourself a drink if you want one." I didn't want their liquor. I scanned the room. Mark wasn't there, probably checking his stocks or rehearsing a speech about his bonus. But in the corner, positioned slightly away from the heat of the fire, sat my grandparents, Arthur and Rose. They were the source of the money, the old money that my parents and brother liked to pretend they had earned themselves. Arthur was 90, Rose was 88. They sat in high-backed wing chairs, looking like porcelain dolls that had been placed on a shelf and forgotten. My parents spoke around them, over them, but never to them. To Robert and Linda, the grandparents were just furniture that hadn't expired yet. I walked over to them. Arthur was staring into the middle distance, his eyes watery and blue. His hands rested on his knees. They were large hands, the knuckles swollen with arthritis, the skin thin as paper. But unlike my father's, these hands had history. Arthur had built the family fortune with a construction company, laying bricks and pouring concrete before he ever put on a suit. "Grandpa," I said softly, kneeling beside his chair. He blinked slowly, turning his head. It took a moment for his eyes to focus on me. "Anna," his voice was gravel rough and quiet. "It's me." "You're cold," he said. "I just got in." I took his hand. It was cold too, colder than mine. I rubbed it gently between my palms. He looked at me, really looked at me, which was more than my parents had done since I walked in. He squeezed my hand. It was a weak grip, but the pressure was deliberate. It was a signal. He was there. He was awake inside that shell. "Rose," he said, nodding to my grandmother. She was dozing, her chin resting on her chest. "I'll let her sleep," I whispered. "Good," Arthur said. "She's tired." "We're both tired." From across the room, my mother's voice carried sharp and loud, talking to my father. "They're having a good day. Dad ate some lunch. I just hope they don't make a mess at dinner. Mark says we need to discuss the trust distribution tonight, and I don't want any distractions." Arthur's grip on my hand tightened just a fraction. He hadn't looked at my mother, but I felt the tension run through his arm. He heard. He heard everything. "I missed you, Grandpa," I said, ignoring my parents. "You work too hard," he murmured, his thumb brushing my wrist. "I can feel the calluses." "I work enough," I said. "Good girl," he whispered. He closed his eyes, retreating back into the guise of the senile old man my parents thought he was. "Stay close tonight, Anna. It's going to be a long dinner." I didn't know what he meant then. I just thought he was lonely. I patted his hand and stood up, smoothing my skirt. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes in their frames. I felt like an intruder in the house I grew up in, a spy in enemy territory. I took a breath and prepared myself for the wine, the turkey, and the inevitable judgment, not knowing that the real cold was waiting for us in the dining room. The dining room was a cavern of mahogany and silver. The chandelier above the table cast a light that was too bright, reflecting off the polished wood and the rims of the wineglasses. It was hot in the room. The fireplace was roaring at one end, and the radiators hissed under the windows, battling the storm outside. I felt the sweat prickle at the back of my neck. We took our seats. My father sat at the head, my mother at the foot. Mark sat across from me, his suit jacket unbuttoned to reveal a silk tie that shimmered under the lights. The grandparents were placed next to me like children at a secondary table, though we were all part of the same rectangle. Arthur's hands shook as he reached for his water glass. I watched him ready to catch it, but he managed to bring it to his lips without spilling a drop. Dinner was served by a catering staff I didn't recognize. They moved silently, placing plates of dry turkey, truffle mashed potatoes, and glazed carrots in front of us. The wine was poured. It was a Cabernet, thick and dark. I took a sip. It tasted like oak and money. Mark swirled his glass, inspecting the legs of the wine against the light. "08," he said. "Good year. We just laid down 3 cases of the 12 in the cellar at home." "How is the cellar holding up?" my father asked. He sliced his turkey with surgical precision. "Excellent," Mark said. "Temperature control is state-of-the-art, unlike this weather. I hope the generator here is serviced, Dad. If the grid goes, you don't want the pipes to freeze." "It's serviced," Robert said. They talked like that for 40 minutes. They talked about infrastructure, about the market volatility in the fourth quarter, about the tuition hikes at St. Jude's, where Mark's twins were enrolled. I ate my turkey. It was sawdust dry, requiring heavy mouthfuls of wine to wash down. No one asked me about the diner. No one asked me about the history book I was writing in my spare time. No one asked me anything. I was a ghost at the feast, visible only when I reached for the salt. My mother looked over at Arthur. He was pushing his peas around the plate. "Dad, eat your protein," she said, her voice pitched loud as if he were deaf. "It's good for you." Arthur didn't look up. He just kept pushing the peas. Rose ate slowly, her eyes fixed on the centerpiece of holly and ivy. "He's slowing down," Mark said, leaning in toward my father. He didn't lower his voice. "I noticed it when I went over the quarterly statements with him last month. He just nods. I'm not sure he's processing the numbers anymore." "He's 90, Mark," I said. It was the first time I had spoken since we sat down. Mark looked at me, blinking as if the salt shaker had started talking. "Cognitive decline is a reality, Anna. We have to be practical about the estate management. Fiduciary responsibility doesn't care about sentiment." "He's sitting right there," I said. "He's fine," my father cut in. "Let Mark speak." I went back to my food. The anger was a small hot stone in my stomach. I focused on the sound of the silverware scraping against the china. It was a violent sound, metal on porcelain. When the plates were cleared, the coffee came. Small espresso cups with gold rims. The catering staff retreated into the kitchen, and the heavy pocket doors were slid shut, sealing us in. The atmosphere shifted. The social pretense evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard edge of business. This was the real tradition, the post-dinner audit. Mark wiped his mouth with his linen napkin and set it on the table. He reached down beside his chair and lifted a thick leather portfolio. He placed it on the table, the heavy thud silencing the room. "Since we're all here," Mark said, unzipping the case, "we need to settle the books for the tax year. There's the matter of the legacy trust distribution." My stomach tightened. I knew about the trust. Granddad had set it up 20 years ago. $1 million allocated for the grandchildren, set to vest when the youngest me turned 28. I had turned 28 in October. "I thought that was automatic," I said. Mark didn't look at me. He opened the file, spreading papers out. Spreadsheets, legal documents, a letterhead from the family law firm. "It is automatic," he said, smoothing a page. "Assuming the beneficiaries meet the stipulations of the trust deed." "Stipulations?" I asked. "Citizenship of good standing." Mark recited, his eyes scanning a document. "No criminal record, and the education clause. Completion of a 4-year degree from an accredited institution with a continuous grade point average reflecting academic excellence." "I have a degree," I said. "I graduated 4 years ago." Mark finally looked at me. His face was a mask of professional regret. "We ran the compliance check, Anna. As the executor of the trust, I have to certify the transcripts." He pulled a sheet of paper from the stack. It looked official. It had a seal. There's a problem. What problem? The State University, Mark said, saying the name like it was a disease. Their accreditation is fine technically, but the trust requires continuous education. Your transcript shows a gap year. And there are flags here during your sophomore year. Incomplete credits. Academic probation warning. That's a lie, I said. My voice was louder than I intended. I never had academic probation. I made the dean's list every semester. And the gap year was because I had to work to pay the tuition you wouldn't cover. Mark sighed. He slid the paper across the table toward our father. Look at the audit, Dad. The registrar flagged the file. Inconsistent credit accumulation. Under the strict terms of the trust, she doesn't qualify as a graduate of good standing. She defaulted on the academic clause. Robert put on his reading glasses. He looked at the paper. He didn't look at me. It says here you withdrew from 2 classes in 2018. I dropped them because I picked up extra shifts, I said. I retook them in the summer. I graduated with a 3.8 GPA. Mark is lying. Anna, lower your voice, my father said, snapping the paper down. Do not accuse your brother of lying. He is a financial professional. This is a legal document. It's a forged document. I stood up. The chair screeched against the floor. I have my diploma. I can log into the portal right now. The portal doesn't matter, Mark said, calm as ice. The trust is governed by the official audit conducted by the trustee. That's me. And based on this report, the distribution cannot be released to you. It would violate the bylaws grandfather wrote. I looked at my mother. She was swirling her coffee, looking bored. Mom, you know I graduated. You came to the ceremony. We went to a ceremony, Linda said, examining her fingernails. We didn't see your transcripts, Anna, and frankly, look at your life. You're waiting tables. You're living in that apartment. Does that look like the life of someone who took their education seriously? The money is intended for the intelligent members of the lineage, people who build things, not whatever this is. The cruelty of it took my breath away. It wasn't just about the money, it was the erasure. They were rewriting my history to fit their disappointment. So that's it, I said, my hands shaking. You just steal my share. It's not stealing, Mark said. It's reallocation. Since you are disqualified, the funds revert to the general pool. However, to keep the tax benefits, we need to distribute them before December 31st. He pulled out another document, this one thick and stapled. I've drawn up a motion to redirect the full $1 million into the education subtrust for my children. It secures their future. Private school Ivy League, no gap years. It stays in the family. It just skips the dead weight. You are unbelievable, I whispered. Sit down, Anna, Robert said. You're embarrassing yourself. I'm embarrassing myself. I looked at them. The 3 of them united in their greed and their arrogance. He is lying to your faces, and you don't care because you want him to have the money. We want the money to go where it will do good, Linda said. Mark's children have a future. We don't want you wasting a legacy on bad decisions. Again. Mark uncapped a fountain pen. It was heavy black lacquer with a gold nib. He stood up and walked around the table to where Arthur sat. My grandfather had been watching the fire, his face blank. Mark placed the document in front of him. Grandpa, Mark said, his voice changing instantly. It became loud, slow, and condescending. We need to sign the papers for the bank. Remember, for the taxes. Arthur didn't move. It's just a formality, Grandpa, Mark said, pointing to the signature line at the bottom of the page. Right here. Then you can go back to sleep. It's for the great-grandchildren, for little Sophie and Jack. You want to help them, don't you? I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the table, but I was frozen. I watched my brother, the MBA, the success story, manipulate a 90-year-old man into signing away my life. Mark, don't, I said. He doesn't know what he's signing. He knows he trusts me, Mark sneered. He pressed the pen into Arthur's hand. Go ahead, Grandpa. Just your name, Arthur Porter, like always. Arthur looked down at the paper. He looked at the pen in his hand. His fingers curled around it. He held it there, hovering over the paper. The room went silent. The only sound was the crackle of the logs in the hearth and the wind beating against the glass. Mark smiled, a tight, triumphant expression. He looked at our parents and winked. The trap was sprung. The theft was legal. All it took was a signature from a man they thought was already gone. The nib of the pen hovered over the signature line, a black point suspended above the cream-colored paper. The room seemed to have run out of air. I watched the ink at the tip of the pen glistening under the chandelier light, waiting for it to touch the fiber and bleed into the page. Mark was leaning forward, his hands flat on the table, his knuckles white. He was holding his breath. My father had taken off his glasses and was polishing them with a slow, rhythmic motion, his eyes fixed on the document. My mother was already looking at her phone, checking the time, or perhaps the weather, confident that the unpleasant business was concluded and the money was safe. Arthur did not sign. He held the pen for 5 seconds. 10. The silence stretched until it became a physical weight, pressing against my eardrums. The fire popped loudly, a knot of sap exploding in the hearth, but Arthur didn't flinch. His hand was steady. It was not the shaking hand of the old man who had spilled his peas earlier. It was a rock. "Right there, Grandpa," Mark said, his voice straining to remain casual. He tapped the paper with his index finger. "On the line. Then we can have dessert." Arthur set the pen down. The click of the heavy barrel hitting the mahogany table echoed like a gunshot. He didn't drop it. He placed it with precision. Then he sat back. The stoop in his shoulders vanished. He rolled his neck, a crack of vertebrae that sounded painful, and placed both hands on the table. He looked at the document, then he looked at Mark. The watery, vague look in his blue eyes was gone. In its place was a clarity that was sharp, cold, and terrifyingly familiar. It was the look he wore in the old photographs, the ones taken on job sites in the 70s, when he was staring down union bosses and zoning boards. "I may be old, Mark," Arthur said. His voice had changed. The gravel was still there, but the tremor was gone. It was deep, resonant, coming from the chest rather than the throat. It filled the room, pushing back the hum of the refrigerator and the rattle of the windows. Mark blinked, pulling back slightly. "Grandpa." "I may be old," Arthur repeated, enunciating every syllable. "But I can still read." "Of course you can," Mark stammered, his smile faltering. "That's why I explained." "You explained nothing," Arthur cut him off. "You lied." Robert stopped polishing his glasses. Linda looked up from her phone. The atmosphere in the room shifted from boredom to sudden sharp alarm. "Dad," Robert said, putting his glasses back on. "Let's not get confused. Mark is just helping you with the—" "Quiet, Robert," Arthur said. He didn't raise his voice, but the command was absolute. He turned his body in the chair, ignoring the pain it clearly caused him, and reached into the inside pocket of his tweed jacket. His hand moved with purpose. He pulled out a white envelope. It was folded in half, slightly crumpled, as if it had been carried around for a while. He smoothed it out on the table, pushing aside Mark's leather portfolio. "I knew you were a shark, Mark," Arthur said, his eyes locked on my brother. "I always knew that. You mistake ruthlessness for intelligence, but I didn't think you were stupid." "I don't understand," Mark said. A flush was creeping up his neck. Arthur opened the envelope. He pulled out a document stamped with a university seal. It was blue and gold. I recognized it immediately. "I wanted to see my granddaughter's grades," Arthur said. He spoke to the room, but he looked at me. "I didn't trust the email. I don't trust computers, so I went to the source." "You went there?" Linda asked, her voice high and brittle. "Last month," Arthur said. "On a Tuesday. I told Rose I was going to the barber. I took the Buick. I drove 3 hours to the State University. My back hurt like hell, but I drove." He tapped the paper. "I walked into the administration building. I spoke to the dean of students. Nice woman. She pulled the file for me." He slid the paper across the table. It stopped in front of Mark. "Read it," Arthur commanded. Mark looked down. He didn't want to, but he couldn't help himself. "It's a transcript," he whispered. "It is an official transcript," Arthur corrected. "Not a spreadsheet you cooked up in Excel It shows a degree awarded with magna cum laude honors. It shows a 3.8 GPA. It shows no academic probation. It shows that my granddaughter worked 2 jobs and still outperformed everyone at this table. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't the silence of waiting. It was the silence of a bomb that had just landed and hadn't yet detonated. Mark's face had gone the color of ash. He stared at the paper as if it were radioactive. "You falsified a trustee report," Arthur said. "You presented a fraudulent audit to the grantor. Do you know what that is, Mark? You have an MBA. Tell me what that is." Mark couldn't speak. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. "It is fraud," Arthur said. "It is a felony. And it is a breach of fiduciary duty so profound that I could have you disbarred from the finance industry by tomorrow morning." "Dad, wait." Robert stood up, his hands raised in a calming gesture. "Let's not use words like fraud. Mark was just interpreting the data. It was a mistake, an administrative error." "Sit down, Robert," Arthur said. "Dad, please." "I said sit down," Arthur roared. The sound was enormous. It shook the glasses on the table. My father collapsed back into his chair, as if he'd been struck. Arthur turned his gaze to my parents. "You watched him," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow louder than the shout. "You sat there eating my food, drinking my wine, and you watched your son rob your daughter. You knew she graduated. You knew she worked hard, and you said nothing. We just thought," Linda started, her voice trembling. "We thought the money would be better used." "You thought you could cut her out because she doesn't fit your picture," Arthur said. "Because she doesn't drive a Mercedes. Because she doesn't beg you for approval." He looked at me then, and his eyes softened. "She is the only one in this room with a spine. She is the only one who is honest." He turned back to Mark. Mark was staring at the table, defeated. The arrogance had evaporated, leaving behind a scared, greedy boy. "Mark," Arthur said, "you are removed as executor of the trust. Effective immediately. I will have the lawyers draft the formal revocation on Monday. If you touch a single penny of the estate, I will press charges, and I will win." Mark nodded a jerky, spasmodic motion. "Robert, Linda," Arthur continued, "you have plenty of money. You don't need mine, and you certainly don't deserve it after tonight. You are out of the will. Everything goes to the grandchildren. And since Mark has proven himself incompetent and dishonest—" Arthur picked up the heavy fountain pen again. He didn't hand it to Mark. He pulled the document Mark had prepared toward him, the one that was supposed to steal my inheritance. "This was an amendment to the trust declaration," Arthur said, reading the header. "Standard boilerplate. Grants the grantor the right to redirect distribution." He uncapped the pen. With bold, angry strokes, he crossed out the entire paragraph that designated the funds to Mark's children. The sound of the nib scratching through the paper was violent. Scritch, scritch, scritch. He obliterated the text until it was nothing but a block of black ink. Then he turned the paper over to the blank side. He smoothed it down. He began to write. He wrote slowly, his hand moving with deliberate care. I watched the ink flow. I, Arthur Porter, direct the trustee to pay the full remainder of the legacy trust immediately to Anna Porter. He signed his name at the bottom. It wasn't the shaky signature of an old man. It was the signature I had seen on old contracts, big and looping and undeniable. He capped the pen. He picked up the paper, blew on the ink to dry it, and then held it out to me. "Take it," he said. I reached out. My hand was shaking, even if his wasn't. I took the paper. It was heavy, high-quality bond. The ink was still wet, glistening black. "This is a legal directive," Arthur said. "I am the grantor. I am of sound mind. I have 2 witnesses here who will testify to that fact, won't you, Robert?" My father looked at the paper in my hand, then at his father. He looked pale, deflated. "Yes, Dad." "Good." Arthur looked at me. "The money is yours, Anna, all of it. Not because you went to school. Not because of your grades. He leaned back in his chair, looking suddenly very tired, the energy of the rage beginning to fade. But because you didn't ask for it, and because you are the only one who stood up to them. I looked at the paper. $1 million. It was a number that didn't feel real. It felt like a phone number or a coordinate. But the weight of the paper was real. Thank you, Grandpa, I whispered. Don't thank me, he said gruffly. I should have done it years ago. I let it go on too long. I wanted to see if they would change. I wanted to see if they had any decency left. He looked at his son and his grandson with pure disgust. I got my answer. Mark finally found his voice. It was thin and reedy. Grandpa, the tax implications. If you transfer the full amount to her, the gift tax alone. I don't care about the taxes, Arthur snapped. I care about the truth. He reached over and patted Rose's hand. She was still staring at the centerpiece, humming a soft, tuneless melody. She seemed oblivious to the carnage that had just taken place, or perhaps she just understood that Arthur was handling it. Rose, he said gently. Wake up, dear. She blinked and looked at him. Is it time to go? Yes, Arthur said. It is definitely time to go. He looked at me. Anna, do you still have that car? The one with the rust? Yes, I said. Good, Arthur said. Get our coats. You're driving us home. The room was silent again, but the power had shifted. The air was no longer sucked out of the room. It was vibrating. Mark was staring at his empty plate. My mother was staring at the wall. My father was staring at his hands. They were small people now. They had been reduced by the truth. I folded the paper carefully, creasing the edge with my thumb, and placed it in the inside pocket of my jacket, right next to my heart. It felt like armor. I stood up. The chair scrapped against the floor, loud and unapologetic. I didn't look at my parents. I walked toward the hallway to get the coats, leaving the three of them sitting in the wreckage of their own greed. The silence in the dining room had a physical weight, like the pressure change before a thunderstorm breaks. The ink on the paper in my pocket was drying, but the heat of it seemed to burn through the lining of my jacket, pressing against my ribs. Mark sat frozen, his hands still resting on the table where the fraudulent documents lay scattered. His face was no longer the smooth, confident mask of the portfolio manager. It was slack and pale. The blood drained away to leave a gray, sickly pallor. He looked at the empty space on the table where the trust amendment had been. Then he looked at me, his eyes wide with a dawning, terrible realization. He wasn't just out $1 million, he was exposed. He had put his signature on a lie, and now that lie was in my pocket. My father Robert was the first to break the paralysis. He cleared his throat, a wet, nervous sound that seemed too loud in the quiet room. He stood up, smoothing his cashmere sweater, trying to reassemble the authority that Arthur had shattered just moments before. Now, Dad, Robert said, his voice pitching higher than usual. Let's not be hasty. We're all family here. Emotions are running high. It's Christmas. Arthur didn't look at him. He was wiping his mouth with his napkin, his movements slow and deliberate. He folded the linen square and placed it next to his plate. The meal is finished, Robert. The meal, yes, Robert stammered, walking around the table toward us. But the business, we can't leave things like this. You're upset. We understand. Mark made a mistake in the paperwork. It happens. We can fix it. There's no need to involve lawyers or change wills. Mark snapped out of his trance. The word lawyers seemed to galvanize him. He pushed his chair back and stood up, his movements jerky. Grandpa, wait. You can't just revoke the executorship like that. The bank requires a formal process, and that paper, the one Anna has, it's not notarized. It won't hold up. I didn't say anything. I just touched the pocket of my jacket. The paper crinkled. It will hold up, Arthur said, not looking at Mark. Because I will call the firm on Monday morning and tell them exactly what you tried to do, unless you want me to call the district attorney instead. Mark flinched. He looked at me, and for the first time in his life, he didn't look down at me. He looked across at me, desperate. Anna, give me the paper. We can work this out. I can cut you a check from my personal account. 10,000. Right now. Just to cover your expenses. 10,000, I said. The number hung in the air, pathetic and insulting. 20, Mark said quickly. Look, you don't want the hassle of the trust. The taxes are a nightmare. I can handle the administration. Just give me the amendment back, and we'll forget this whole outburst. It wasn't an outburst, I said. My voice was steady. I was surprised by how calm I felt. The anger was gone, replaced by a cold clarity. It was a judgment. Anna, please. My mother Linda joined in. She stood up, clutching her wineglass. She didn't come toward me. She stayed by her chair as if afraid to get too close to the wreckage. Don't be difficult. Think about the family. Think about your nephews. Do you really want to take money away from children? You were going to take it away from me, I said. That's different, she said, her eyes darting between Arthur and me. We were just managing the assets, protecting the legacy. You know how you are with money, Anna. You struggle. We didn't want you to be overwhelmed. I pay my own rent, I said. I pay my own bills. I haven't asked you for a cent in 6 years. I think I can manage. Dad. Robert turned back to Arthur, his voice taking on a begging tone. Talk to her. Tell her to be reasonable. You can't cut us out. We're your children. This house, the maintenance, we rely on the estate support. Arthur finally looked at his son. You have your own money, Robert. You have the firm. If you can't maintain this house, sell it. It's too big for you anyway. It's cold. Sell it. Robert looked horrified. This is the family seat. It's a pile of bricks, Arthur said, and it's full of liars. The room fell silent again. The bargaining was failing. They realized slowly that the leverage they had always held, money approval inclusion, was gone. I had the money. I didn't need their approval. And I had no desire to be included in this. From the other side of Arthur, a soft voice cut through the tension. Arthur. It was Rose, my grandmother. She had been silent through the shouting, staring at the holly centerpiece. Now she lifted her head. Her eyes were clear, bright, with a sudden sharp lucidity. She looked at Linda, then at Robert, then at Mark. She didn't look angry. She looked disappointed. Take us home, she said. We haven't had dessert, Mom, Linda said, her voice trembling. The staff made a Yule log. I don't want your cake, Rose said. She pushed her chair back. I want to go home. The air is bad in here. I'll get the coats, I said. I turned and walked out of the dining room. I didn't wait for permission. I felt their eyes on my back, but no one moved to stop me. Mark was too terrified of his grandfather, and my parents were too shocked by the sudden collapse of their world. I walked into the foyer. It was colder out here, away from the roaring fire of the dining room. The Christmas tree twinkled in the corner, thousands of tiny white lights reflecting in the dark windows. It looked garish now, a performative display of joy in a house that had none. I went to the closet and slid the door open. The smell of cedar and mothballs drifted out. I found Arthur's coat. It was a heavy wool trench gray and stiff with age. He had worn it for 20 years. I pulled it off the hanger. Then I found Rose's, a thick down parka that she complained made her look like a marshmallow but which kept her warm. I grabbed my own coat, the frayed wool feeling thin compared to theirs. I put mine on first, buttoning it to the chin. When I turned around, they were there. All of them. They had drifted out of the dining room like debris caught in a current. Arthur was leaning on the back of a chair for support, breathing heavily. Rose stood beside him, holding his arm. My parents and Mark stood a few feet away, forming a barrier between us and the door. You can't drive them, Robert said. He was trying to sound authoritative, but he just sounded tired. It's a blizzard out there. That car of yours isn't safe. My car is fine, I said. I walked over to Arthur. Here, Grandpa. I held the coat up. He turned slowly, wincing as his stiff shoulders rotated. I slid his right arm into the sleeve, then the left. I moved around to the front of him. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline fading to leave behind the frailty of 90 years. I did up the buttons for him. They were large plastic buttons. My fingers brushed against his chest. I could feel the heat of him through his shirt, the slow, steady beat of his heart. He looked down at me as I worked. His eyes were tired, but they were kind. He rested a hand on my shoulder to steady himself. "Thank you, Anna," he whispered. "I got you," I said. I turned to Rose. She held her arms out like a child. I helped her into the parka and zipped it up. I pulled her scarf tight around her neck and made sure her hat was pulled down over her ears. "You're a good girl," she said, patting my cheek. Her hand was dry and soft. "We're leaving," I said to the room. "Anna, don't do this," Mark said. He stepped forward. "If you walk out that door with that paper, and with them, there's no coming back. You're burning the bridge." I looked at him. I looked at the brother who had mocked my job, the brother who had tried to steal my future to buy another ski boat or fund a trust for toddlers who already had everything. "The bridge was rotten, Mark," I said. "I didn't burn it, you did." I took Arthur's arm. I took Rose's arm. We began to move toward the door. The parents didn't move. They stood there in their expensive clothes in their expensive hallway watching us leave. They looked smaller than I had ever seen them. They looked like strangers. I opened the front door. The wind hit us like a physical blow. The snow was coming down harder now, horizontal sheets of white moving through the darkness. It swirled into the foyer, landing on the marble floor and melting instantly. "Careful," I said. "The steps are slick." We walked out into the night. I guided them down the steps one at a time. Step, wait, step, wait. The wind tore at our clothes. The cold was shocking after the suffocating heat of the house. It burned my lungs clean and sharp. We reached the car. It was covered in 3 inches of fresh snow. I opened the back door for them. It groaned on its hinges. I brushed the snow off the seat. "In you go," I said. I helped Rose in first, then Arthur. He grunted as he bent his knees, collapsing onto the worn fabric of the back seat. I slammed the door shut, sealing them in. I walked around to the driver's side, brushing the snow off the windshield with my gloved hand. I got in. The car was freezing. I could see my breath in the air. I put the key in the ignition and turned it. The engine cranked once, twice, an agonizing sound in the quiet night. "Come on," I thought. "Don't fail me now." It caught. The engine roared to life, settling into a steady, rhythmic idle. I turned the heater on full blast. I turned on the headlights. The beams cut through the swirling snow, illuminating the driveway and the line of luxury cars that would never have to worry about starting in the cold. I looked in the rearview mirror. Arthur and Rose were huddled together in the back seat, holding hands. They looked small, but they looked safe. "Everyone okay?" I asked. "Drive," Arthur said. I put the car in reverse. The tires spun for a second on the ice, whining, searching for grip. Then they caught the gravel. I backed out, swinging the nose of the car around toward the exit. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't look at the window where I knew my mother was watching. I focused on the road. The tunnel of trees was white and ghostly in the headlights. The snow was deep, dragging at the undercarriage, but the Honda pushed through. We rolled down the long driveway, past the stone walls, past the iron gates. We turned onto the main road. It was empty. Just a ribbon of white stretching out into the blackness. The silence in the car was different now. It wasn't the heavy, weaponized silence of the dining room. It was the silence of escape. It was the silence of people who have survived a crash and are just breathing, grateful to be alive. I reached into my pocket and touched the paper one last time just to make sure it was there. Then I put both hands on the wheel. The vibration of the road traveled up my arms. It felt real. It felt like the only real thing that had happened all night. "It's going to take a while," I said to the mirror. "The roads are bad." "We're in no rush," Arthur said from the darkness of the back seat. "Take your time, Anna. We're going home." I nodded. I turned on the radio, keeping the volume low. static than the faint sound of a jazz station playing something slow and melancholy. We drove into the storm, leaving the lights of the estate behind us fading into the white until there was nothing in the mirror but the night. The drive to my grandparents' house took 40 minutes. We moved slower than the traffic, staying in the right lane where the plows had done their best work. The silence in the car wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the soft, rhythmic breathing of two people who had finally let go of a heavy weight. Rose had fallen asleep within 5 minutes, her head resting on Arthur's shoulder. Arthur stared out the window at the passing streetlights, watching the snow swirl in the yellow beams. We didn't speak. There was nothing left to say about the dinner or the money or the family we had left behind in that mausoleum of a house. We turned into their neighborhood. It was a grid of small, post-war bungalows built for soldiers returning home in the 50s. The houses were close together, separated by chain-link fences and dormant hedges. It was a different world from the estate. Here, the driveways were short, and the Christmas lights were multicolored strings draped over porch railings blinking out of sync. It wasn't grand, but it was alive. I pulled into their driveway. It hadn't been shoveled, and the Honda crunched over the drifts. I put the car in park and killed the engine. The silence rushed back in, accompanied by the ticking of the cooling metal. "We're here," I said softly. Arthur patted Rose's hand. "Wake up, Rosie. We're home." She stirred, blinking. "Are we?" "Yes," he said. "Home." I got out and went through the ritual of the doors again. The wind had died down slightly, leaving a heavy, silent snowfall that blanketed everything in white. I helped them out, their joints stiff from the ride. We walked up the narrow concrete path to the front door. I took the keys from Arthur's pocket, his fingers too cold to work the lock. The door opened with a familiar creak, and we stepped into the smell of their life-old paper peppermint and the faint sweet scent of pipe tobacco. I helped them off with their coats. Rose went immediately to the thermostat to turn up the heat, then shuffled toward the kitchen to put the kettle on. She was resilient in her own way, falling back into her routine as if the shouting match at the estate had been a dream. Arthur didn't move. He stood in the hallway, leaning heavily on his cane, watching me hang his coat on the rack. The house was small. From where I stood, I could see the living room with its worn velvet sofa and the photos on the mantel, black and white pictures of men in hard hats standing in front of steel skeletons of buildings that didn't exist anymore. "Anna," he said. I turned. He looked older under the harsh hallway light. The fire that had animated him at the dinner table had dimmed, leaving him tired and pale. "You should stay the night," he said. "The roads." "I have a shift in the morning," I said. "I need to get back." He nodded, accepting this. He knew about work. He took a step toward me and placed a hand on my arm. His grip was weak, but his eyes were steady. "I have to apologize," he said. "Grandpa, you don't—" "I do," he interrupted. "I waited too long. I knew they were sharks. I knew your father was weak and your brother was greedy. But I needed to know if they were criminals. I needed to see if they would actually cross the line." "They crossed it," I said. "Yes," he said. "They did." He looked down at his shoes, then back at me. "I'm sorry you had to be the bait. I'm sorry I let them treat you like that for so long. I thought maybe they would surprise me. A father always hopes." "It's okay," I said, and I meant it. I didn't mind. "Why?" he asked. "Why didn't you mind?" "Because I didn't need them," I said. I felt the truth of it in my chest, solid and unbreakable. I didn't need their money. I didn't need their approval. I survived them, Grandpa. I built a life without them. That's why tonight didn't hurt me. It just clarified things." Arthur smiled. It was a small, dry smile. "That is why you deserve it, Anna. The money destroys people who need it. It ruins the weak. But you are already made." "I'll use it well," I said. "I know," he said. "Now go, before the snow traps you here." He kissed my cheek. His skin was like parchment. I watched him walk into the living room and sit in his chair. He didn't turn on the TV. He just sat there listening to the kettle whistle in the kitchen. I walked back out to the car. The drive to the highway was slow. The snow was falling vertically now, big, heavy flakes that accumulated fast. I merged onto the interstate. It was desolate. I was the only car on the road, a pair of headlights cutting a tunnel through the dark. 10 miles outside the city, the fuel light pinged on the dashboard. I pulled off at a rest stop. It was a brightly lit island in the sea of black and white. The fluorescent lights of the canopy hummed, buzzing against the silence of the storm. I got out and swiped my card. The pump clicked. I stood there holding the cold metal handle, listening to the gas rush into the tank. The wind whipped around the pillars, blowing snow into my face, melting on my eyelashes. I smelled the gasoline, sharp and chemical. It was a real smell. It smelled like movement. I reached into my pocket. The envelope was there. The paper was warm from my body heat. $1 million. It was enough to buy a house, enough to quit the diner, enough to finish my book without worrying about the electric bill. But standing there in the freezing cold, watching the numbers tick up on the pump, I realized Arthur was right. The money wasn't the victory. The money was just a tool. The victory was that I was standing here alone, pumping my own gas, and I wasn't afraid. I wasn't waiting for permission. The pump clicked off. I put the nozzle back. I walked into the station store. The attendant was asleep behind the counter, a kid with headphones around his neck. I poured a cup of coffee from the carafe. It had been sitting there for hours. I paid for it with crumpled bills from my tips. I walked back to the car and stood outside for a moment. I took a sip of the coffee. It was burnt bitter and scalded my tongue. It was the best thing I had tasted all night. It warmed me all the way down. I looked back the way I had come. The tire tracks I had made pulling in were already filling up with snow. The white powder was smoothing everything over, erasing the path, covering the dirt and the ice. The road back to the estate, back to my parents, back to the person they wanted me to be, it was gone. There was no trace of it left. I got back into the car. The engine was warm. I put the coffee in the cup holder and shifted into drive. The headlights caught the falling snow, turning the world into a blur of motion. I didn't look in the rearview mirror again. The snow covered the road behind me, erasing the tracks back to that house. I put the car in gear and looked only forward. As the snow settled behind her car, the cold house in Connecticut finally became a memory she no longer had to carry. Anna's story reminds us that true resilience often means knowing when to walk away with your head held high. If you enjoyed this journey of justice and independence, please subscribe and leave a comment below. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.